Now there's an anniversary that's sort of taking place around this time of year. There's a date that has now burned into the memory of the American people. That date is September the 11th, right? We all remember it. There was September the 10th, the great victory of Admiral Perry on Lake Erie when he defeated the British in the War of 1812, but that's gone. It's now September the 11th, and the Twin Towers, we can still see it, the vision of it, right? The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center come down, and that will initiate a war. The President of the United States now speaks to the American people, and he announces the war. The war is against terrorism. Officially against terrorism, but the people who are the terrorists. The terrorists are the Muslim fundamentalist terrorists. War. And in fact, the first action taken in that war was to invade a country. And in fact, that invasion, unlike the invasion of Iraq, was supported by the overwhelming majority of the American people and by the overwhelming majority of the nations of the world. The name of the country was Afghanistan, and up until that time, it was like Korea before the Korean War, or Vietnam before the Vietnam War. What did we know? Suddenly, there appeared on our screen this country called Afghanistan. Why Afghanistan? Well, it was very clear that the assault on the Twin Towers had been conducted by an organization called Al-Qaeda. It was also clear that the head of that organization was a Saudi Arabian by the name of Osama bin Laden. And he was residing comfortably, uncomfortably, I think comfortably. He was residing comfortably in Afghanistan. So we said to the government of Afghanistan, which at that time was an extremist fundamentalist government called the Taliban, we said to them, turn him over. And they, foolishly, but they were somewhat divorced from reality, they foolishly said no. Well, they said no. They are harboring a criminal, and in fact the president said, we will pursue the criminals wherever they are, and we will assault the people who provide them with shelter. So we're off to the war. And the war began in November, the invasion. And it lasted basically for 2 months. It was a short war, and it proved to be very successful. We brought down the Taliban. By January, or by the end of December of 2001, the United States and its allies, and it had many allies. There were the British, there were the French, there were the Germans, there were the Japanese. All these people joined us because the war against the criminals seemed to be absolutely just. So by the end of December, we were already beginning to put together some kind of interim government for Afghanistan. Now, the war in Afghanistan was a continuation of a war that had been going on since 1979. A long war. We were just sort of the end of the war. All right? There was a long war, so let me remind you of that war into which we entered. In 1978, the communists took over Afghanistan. The Communist Party was the most vocal and powerful opposition to the clergy in Afghanistan. And obviously they had received the support of the Soviet Union, which was right on the border. In 1978, the Soviet Union still existed. It was 13 years before its dissolution. And in fact, all the countries of Central Asia, which are now independent, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, which border on Afghanistan, they were part of the Soviet Union. So the communists in Afghanistan received strong support. And one of the great programs of the Communist Party was the secularization of society. Got it? Lots of people had difficulty understanding Marxism. It didn't seem to apply to Afghanistan because there wasn't very much of a working class. I mean, they were all peasants living in villages. But they understood modernization, they understood secularization, and there was a fairly substantial, believe it or not, in those days, there was a fairly substantial number of people in Afghanistan who wanted to secularize the country and who were hostile to the control imposed on Afghanistan in the villages in particular by the clergy. So in 1978, they seized power basically through a military coup. The style in Afghanistan is not elections, right? You know, it's a coup. So through a military coup, they seized power, and in fact, the man who was the head of the Communist Party, and certainly the man in touch with Moscow, was a man by the name of Taraki, who now became the president of Afghanistan. Now, the communists seemed to have control because most of the officers in the Afghan army, and they had all the guns, were sympathetic. Most of them had received their training in the Soviet Union. So the army supported Taraki, but then there arose a problem. It's one of the major problems in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country with two major nations. You see, we say Afghan. It's like saying Canadian. Well, do you mean English Canadian or do you mean French Canadian? They hate each other. No. They don't like each other. They speak different languages. They think they have different cultures. So we say Canadian. It's a geographic term. It's a political term, a geographic term. It's not what we call a national term. So Afghanistan has two nations. There's one nation that has approximately 60% of the population. They have two names. One is Pathan, P-A-T-H-A-N, but the one that is used more frequently is Pushtoo, P-U-S-H-T-O-O, the Pushtoos, all right? And the other nation, which is 40% of the population, is called Tajik, T-A-J-I-K. In fact, there's a country north of Afghanistan which was part of the Soviet Union that's called Tajikistan. So this is some of the leftover people of that nation. Most of the Pushtoos live in the south of Afghanistan, and most of the Tajiks live in the north of Afghanistan, and they historically do not like each other. So the vice president under Taraki was a Pushtoo, but Taraki was a Tajik. And the Pushtoos were accustomed to ruling. They were 60%, right? So, unbeknownst to the people in Moscow, and in Moscow at that time there was this wonderfully energetic, charismatic leader called Leonid Brezhnev. You may remember him. Okay, fine. Unbeknownst to Brezhnev, the vice president kills the president. He strangles him, actually. Taraki is... I mean, we can't imagine such a thing in our country, but I mean, no. The vice president strangled the president because there was this rivalry between the Pushtoos and the Tajiks which preceded the arrival of communism. Both were secularists. Both were communists. But more important than their communism or their secularism was Pushtoo Tajik. So now the vice president takes over. Brezhnev is furious. Furious. So now he decides to do something. He's been having a hard time in the Soviet Union. The economy is declining. The relative power of the Soviet Union in comparison to the United States is what? Declining. It's all falling apart. People are mumbling and grumbling in Moscow and everywhere else. He needs a win. Oh. The way to win is to expand the Soviet empire. He'll simply send the Russian troops into this backward country where no effective resistance could possibly be made to Russian technology. You understand that. And he'll take it, boom, boom, boom. He'll take Afghanistan, and now he will add it to the Soviet empire, and now his prestige and the prestige of his government will be enhanced. If he can't give the Russians food, he'll give them glory, which people can chew on for a while. It's not very nutritious, but you can chew on it for, you chew on it for a while, and it seems to taste good. All right, so you may remember it. It was about the same time that Ayatollah Khomeini took over in Iran. Exactly the same time. The Russian troops, the Shah falls in Iran, and the Russian troops, the Soviet troops, now invade Afghanistan with massive modern technology. Tanks, planes, the whole thing. Brezhnev said it'll be over in a week. Not over in a week. If you want to know the trigger that brought down the Soviet Union, it's a trigger. It was the war in Afghanistan. It was the final straw. It bankrupted the credibility of the Soviet government in the eyes of the Soviet people. The Russians went in, and in fact, they overthrew the vice president. They couldn't revive Taraki. He was already gone. So they found a substitute for him, an alcoholic Muslim. No. His name was Babrak Kamal. You may not remember him because how can you remember all those names and whatever? He was nondescript, but he was loyal to Brezhnev. And he was now put in charge of the government, supported by Soviet troops who were now in the capital of Afghanistan, which is called Kabul. And actually, Kamal was inspired by Ataturk. Ataturk died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was the great leader who rescued Turkey and modernized it. He hated religion so much, Islam so much, that he drank all the time to spite it. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, give me another drink. All right, fine. So there was Kamal, and now there's the Russian army moving throughout Afghanistan. But what it triggered was a rebellion. In 1979, the clergy were taking over in Iran. They rebelled against the Shah, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. In Afghanistan, now the clergy, whether it was Pushtoo or Tajik, rebelled. They rose up in a holy fury. They had an enemy. The atheists, the secularists, whatever it was. And they now began to mobilize the people. And out of it came these revolutionary militias. Where did they find their arms? Oh, you have to understand. The great enemy of the United States of America was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was now engaged in a war in Afghanistan. And now there were all these people who wanted to fight them and humiliate them. Oh, how wonderful. Was to send them help. So we sent lots of money to the people who would help us, our ally, a Muslim country on the border of Afghanistan, Pakistan, because all aid ultimately would have to pass through Pakistan. It couldn't pass through the Soviet Union. And the Pakistanis would get the guns, or we sent the military equipment itself, the guns, whatever it was, and now they pour across the Afghan border, and now all these rebels have guns and equipment and money. And almost every day, a new revolutionary militia is being invented or created by another clergyman. The Russians do not know what hit them. They are now fighting a kind of war with guerrillas. It was the Vietnam War of the Russians. They're stuck in this country where the overwhelming majority of the people, mobilized by the clergy, want them out. Well, the war goes on, and on, and on. It does not stop. It will go on for 8 years. And during the course of that time, the Russian army will be humiliated. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Russian soldiers will be killed. And in fact, for the first time in Soviet history, Russian mothers will go to Afghanistan to take their sons back home. Do you remember those stories? I loved it. It's like a Jewish mother. You give me back my son. Do you understand? I'm here. I crossed the border. I know they're shooting. Do you understand? I want my kid back. You give him back to me right away. I mean, it was so humiliating. And now, what was supposed to be the triumph that was to rescue the Soviet regime turns out to be this disaster. The cost of it. The economy is bad anyway. Now the cost of it is bankrupting the Soviet Union. And the people in the Soviet Union hate the draft. And they hate the war. And there's no prospect of an end to it because more and more arms are pouring across the border to help these people. The Russians discover after a while they don't control the countryside. They only control the major cities. At night, in between any major city, they wouldn't even venture out. Only during the day. The communist government, which was so optimistic and which had considerable support in the cities, is now besieged in Kabul. In 1986, Kemal's liver gives out. Remember Kemal? He was the alcoholic that took over. His liver gives out. Well, you know. So he's succeeded by a rather dashing figure, actually. His name, very different from Kemal, his name is Najibullah. He was the vice president. And Najibullah now takes over with the consent, obviously, of Brezhnev. This is no change done behind Brezhnev's back. Actually, by now, Brezhnev is what? Is gone to another place. No. Yeah. Brezhnev died. I mean, what follows now is the regime of Andropov, and then there will be Chernenko, and then there will be Gorbachev, and the whole thing. But, so now they approve, it doesn't make any difference. They're stuck. Humiliated. Now, at this time, something will happen that will be very interesting. The war in Afghanistan, which is led against the secularists. That war inspires young people all over the Muslim world to come to Afghanistan to be volunteers against the enemy. So they show up by the thousands. They come from the Persian world. They come from the Arab world. They come from Africa. Whatever it be, they pour into Afghanistan. One of them is Osama bin Laden. That's where he was radicalized. That's where he all these volunteers from all over the world, and they were all fired up in this noble cause of driving the enemy from the world of Islam. In fact, Afghanistan produced the troops of terrorism, no doubt about it. That's where that was their training program. So if you're talking about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and terrorism today, well, the furnace in which they were, do you understand, forged, that was Afghanistan. That's where it happened. Pakistan are soldiers for the army of Allah. The net result is the Russians are defeated. By the time Gorbachev comes to power, he realizes surrounded by these howling fanatics. Do you understand? And all these ambitious leaders, and with all start fighting each other, because the question is,